Welcome to another episode of the Modern Maker Workroom, and today we'll be working with the interior of the garment and putting the lining in place. Before we can work with any of the lining pieces though, we need to trim away the excess padding that's in the armhole. This will, if we leave this in place, it'll prevent us from properly installing the sleeves. So we need to free up some room in order for our sleeves to be sewn in and the seam allowance to be turned back and to nest well with the padding on the interior. So the amount we're trimming away is actually double what we need for our seam allowance, because what we want is for the bulk of the sleeve seam allowance to sit right alongside the thickness of the padding, and that will help keep it a nice smooth transition from the body into the armhole, and it won't have a large lumpy, uncomfortable area. Everything should sit nicely together. So we'll do that on both sides, and you'll see here that my pad stitching has actually kind of gone into the area I need to trim, so I'm just kind of digging my scissors underneath the padding and trimming away and clipping the threads. I'm just being bold about it. I don't want to fuss. I don't want to worry about like carefully unpicking anything. There's no need, because as soon as it's trimmed, it just peels right out. So here we have the front lining piece is just laid in place, and I'm just gently putting it where it belongs. I have used a little finger crease to fold back the front edge there, see? And I just want to align it so that it's more or less sitting where it belongs. I'll get more specific as I start basting it in place. And please, as it says on the screen, don't forget to click the like button, because that helps us with the YouTube algorithm and helps other people see these videos and learn these techniques. I have a piece of thread here, and I will be basting up the front and then around the neckline and then moving right into the armhole. And this piece of lining is slightly larger than it needs to be, and if you recall from when we cut the lining way back at the beginning of this doublet, it was very intentional that we cut it slightly large. We're expecting it to lay in place, and we're also expecting it to shrink over time with wear. Because it's linen, because it's not been pre-washed, we wanted to make sure that we give enough fullness so that the garment has some longevity. If you think about it in terms of historical costuming, pre-washing textiles the way we do was not really a thing back then. So it's important to take that into account. I prefer to work with linen while it's still nice and crispy. The diagonal basting that I'm using is being set pretty far back from the edge, and that's because we'll be manipulating all of these edges in terms of like putting the lining in place and sewing seams in those areas. So we want to keep it open so that we can really get our fingers in to do the work. As I come around the armhole, I am going to be actually pulling a little bit of fullness in, and that's because if you recall, when we made the body, we actually pinched some of the size out of the armhole, and that was to help shape it around the side of the bust. So I'm taking that into account as I put this lining in place. Now we also, in addition to pinching those out, we also made the lining slightly larger. So we have quite a bit of fullness that we're going to be easing into place in the armhole. This ease really, in the long run, does help the garment hang better and feel better. It looks terrible as you're making it, but over time, you'll be glad that you put this extra fullness in. It's important to place the front padding over the back padding at the side seam, and then as we're basting our lining in place, we'll just make sure that that gets secured. And in just a moment here, once I run out of thread, I'm going to flip this over and just show you how high the lining is sticking up above the armhole. Now, we cut the lining a little bit higher in the bottom of the armpit, specifically because we need to have some vertical ease. Because of the way the garment curves around the body, it's important to have that. Otherwise, you could end up with a wrinkle because the lining will pull up too short when it's finally worn. It's a little complicated to explain while everything is flat on the table, but nonetheless, just know that it's important to have a little bit of extra length from the waistline to the bottom of the armpit in a garment, particularly one that's going to be pulled tight like this. This same kind of lining adjustment is actually used in modern jackets as well, and it really just prevents any wrinkle from showing up on the outside of the garment because the lining is too short. I think this is where a lot of people make a big mistake in historical clothing, because they so often will cut the lining exactly the same shape as the exterior and then get really surprised and frustrated when the lining seems suddenly too short. And that's because the lining, if it's cut the same size as the outside of the garment, it already is too short. It's just the nature of the physics of wearing a garment that curves over the body in that location. It's much easier to describe on a mannequin, and I'm sorry I don't have one in the shot right now since we're putting the lining in. But it just trust me and know that that is a truth, that the lining needs to be a little bit longer at the side just to be able to accommodate the outer length of the garment. Now I'm just going to flip this over so that you can see the outside of the garment is not affected at all by the shape of the lining, and that's really the reason why we have all of the extra room and all of the ease, is because there is absolutely no need for the lining to affect the outer shape. We just can't have that happen. The outer shape is I always say that the outer fabric is the truth of the garment, meaning that's what we're really trying to follow. The canvas is what holds the structure, but the outer surface of the fabric is the thing that has to be perfect. So we make our lining slightly imperfect and slightly loose so that we can accommodate that. And this process I'm doing right now is just kind of collapsing the lining into place. Now these wrinkles will definitely pull out a little bit more once the basting is gone and once all of the actual stitching is complete in the lining, when we use our fell stitches to put it in place. Now I am leaving the top like inch and a half, the top 3 centimeters or so, loose and free, because I do have to get into the neckline at some point later. So I'm starting this fell stitching a little bit down from the neckline, and as I work, this edge is a little complicated because there's a bone behind it, but as I work, I'm trying to make sure that I take at least 1 if not 2 stitches in the center of each ring, so the lining actually covers the back portion of the lacing rings. And I think that's important just because it helps keep all of the massive amounts of stitching that we use to hold the ring in place. It helps keep that out of sight. And you can see I'm really struggling here because the bone is already in. I suppose I could slip the bone out the top and stitch this, but I think I've actually already done my securing stitching at either end of the bone, so I'm a little bit stuck with this. But this is definitely a spot where you might make a different choice and leave the bone out until after the lining is in place, and then you can slide the boning in. It is difficult to work with it, but not impossible. You can see that now I'm sort of adapting my technique by bending the bone very sharply so that I can get my needle through, and this high quality boning springs right back. I'm not worried about it kinking permanently. There are several different ways to handle the point of the lining as you work, but the easiest thing for me is, since I'm not trying to sandwich the skirting into this seam, I can just do whatever I need to with the lining. So I basically just fold it a whole bunch of times to get the point to be the shape that I need it to be, and then I use my needle and thread to really nail it down into place. Once it's sewn, then I can take the iron and I can heat it up and squash it just a little bit to kind of flatten out the lining and keep it from being too bulky. But this is the point of the garment, so if it's a tiny bit bulky, it's really not a huge deal, especially because we're lacing this closed. Now, if I were putting in an eyelet or a buttonhole, I would have a very different attitude about this. I might actually unfurl the lining a little bit and stitch it in a way that just secures it flat but not too thick, and it may not actually be the same shape as the point of the doublet on the outside. And this is something that you can see sometimes in some later 17th century pieces where the points are extremely sharp, and you see that the lining is not sewn in quite at the same spot as the seam on the outside, and that's just to reduce bulk. But once I've folded it all up and sort of squashed it into place, you can see that I just turn the work and keep doing the stitching. I'm working my way across the bottom, and I'll jump ahead and work my way up the seam, and then we'll be ready to move on to the next step. Now, this is where some period work really differs a lot from how modern things are sewn. Now, for most modern jackets, we will stitch the lining separately and then just kind of drop it into the garment and secure it around the edges. But for a good period garment, and even for any stage garment that needs to last a long time, you want to secure each piece of lining in its own right. So we have felled across the bottom, we felled down center front, and now we're just going to permanently baste the edge of the lining onto the seam allowance. Now I'm not going through to the outside, I'm just going through the seam allowance here. As you can see, the seam allowance has been pressed open and the lining is going across the flat seam allowance, and I'm actually securing the edge of this lining to the back seam allowance that has been folded back. And this just helps keep everything nice and flat. And then in the next segment, I'll put the back lining in place, and then it'll be hemmed down on top of this seam allowance, covering up our basting lines. What this does is it makes the lining incredibly secure, and it moves as one with the exterior instead of possibly slipping around on its own. You can see right here, I'm stitching through the padding, securing the front on top of the back, as I mentioned earlier in the video. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Modern Maker. I really hope that you're having a good time with this woman's doublet, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much, and happy stitching.